When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Zootopia 2 has come home to Disney+.
Let's go!
Get ready for a new case.
We're gonna crack this case and prove we're the greatest partners of all time!
New friends.
You are...
Gary the Snake.
And your last name?
The Snake.
Dream team.
And new habitats.
Zootopia has a secret reptile population.
You can watch the record-breaking phenomenon at home.
You're clearly working it.
Zootopia 2, now available on Disney+, rated PG.
Drink? Now, shall we begin?
Well, looking at Weimar itself, the thing that struck me is that most people were so concerned with their own personal lives, and that's, understandable given the crises that they went through and hyperinflation, for example. I mean, that really, shocked people to the core when the currency suddenly isn't worth anything anymore and your entire economic world just breaks apart. Those kinds of things make it understandable that people focus just on their own lives, but it means that you lose sight of the stuff that's around you. And I think there's a risk today that we do the same thing.
Hello. On the morning of the 19th of January, 1933, Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. There are many dates that can be used to identify the end of the Weimar Republic, but this is probably the most appropriate. The constitution that had held since 1919 was in mortal danger. Weimar, the town which gave the republic its name, by Hitler incidentally, is the title of a new book by Katja Hoyer, best-selling author of Blood and Iron and Beyond the Wall. We discuss the atmosphere best exemplified by the people of the pretty little town, but one that had a dark secret nearby. Plenty more great history on the way, including ancient Sparta, and the next film club is The English Patient. But until then, let's proceed with Weimar and Katja Hoyer. Katja, welcome. Great pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Love to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to talking to you about this. Your wonderful new book, Weimar, which is so interesting, actually. I've been reading it the last week since actually we bumped into each other just over a week ago. And I was wondering, I mean, this is a really clever idea. So you're obviously, and it's quite an obvious idea as well, I suppose, but looking at Weimar through Weimar. But I suppose for many people like me before I started reading this book, I had no real idea that the Weimar Republic, which is that period between the First World War and the Nazis taking over, I had no idea actually the name Weimar Republic was really given to it by Adolf Hitler. I had no idea.
Yeah, it's all kind of entangled. So most people don't realize that it is named after the town in the first place where it was founded. So in 1919, shortly after the First World War, the deputies who were trying to set up a new German state basically didn't feel particularly safe in Berlin because there were communist uprisings, brutally being crushed by kind of ex-soldiers who are being brought in to do just that. So it's certainly not safe in Berlin, and they wonder where to go. And so they end up going to Weimar to found the new republic because it's in the center of Germany. It's quite a nice, cozy little town. And it's also associated with German high culture, kind of many famous poets and sort of composers and German thinkers lived and worked there over the centuries, so it seemed a good place. It wasn't called the Weimar Republic just then, even though it was founded there. But basically Hitler used this term in the late 1920s to say this isn't a German construct, it's not a German state. So officially this whole thing was still called the German Reich after the previous kind of political construct. And Hitler is deliberately making a point here to say this is not a German thing. This is basically established by Jews, socialists, internationalist elements, all the usual tropes of the day. And so he kind of spat out the words sort of Weimar Republic. This is a Weimar Republic, not a German one. And interestingly, we now kind of remember it by that term, not least to distinguish it from the other German republics that came afterwards. But the name stuck and is kind of quite disassociated now from the town where it first came from.
But it's it seems to me, at least, and you know it very well, but Weimar seems just such a typical German town.
Well, it isn't. I mean, partially it is more typical than Berlin, I would say, because it's not the capital. And as we all know from, France, England, wherever you look, the capital tends to be quite different from the rest of the country. And that's quite true, actually, for Berlin in the 1920s. So most of the stuff that we associate with that time, the political cabaret, the quite risque entertainment and art scene and all of that is very, very Berlin. I mean, even the other major German cities like Munich and, Cologne, they're all far more conservative and don't really kind of look at this with a bit of suspicion. So Weimar as a small town is in that respect perhaps a bit more typical for a society that still largely lived in towns and in the countryside rather than in cities. But on the flip side, it is a special place. That's why it was chosen in the first place. It has got this status as the cultural heart of Germany. It's where Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who's, I would say, perhaps the closest thing Germany has to a national poet, sort of the German Shakespeare, if you will, where he sort of lived and worked and died. And so that's associated with this kind of really classical period in German literature. His friend Schiller, also a very famous German author, lived there as well and worked there with him.
There's a statue of the both of them, isn't there?
There is indeed, in front of the theatre where the Weimar Republic was founded. And that's a bizarre picture. I mean, you see this kind of throughout, a bit like the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, you see it throughout the different ages with different people in front of it. And you wonder, it's just so bizarre. You've got Friedrich Ebert there, the kind of first president of the Weimar Republic, true Democrat and quite left-leaning. And then a few years later, you see Hitler posing in front of the same memorial, which sums up the town, really. But that's why I'm saying it's not necessarily representative of Germany as a whole, because it does have this kind of status as a culture capital. It's also very conservative and very kind of middle class as a result of that.
Well, yes, there are these tensions, aren't there, between those more sort of this sort of student side and liberal-minded with a more, I guess, conservative or even reactionary group within Weimar, which I suppose is true of the wider Germany.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite unusual for Weimar because on the whole it is quite sort of small c conservative. You've got lots of fairly affluent, well-educated, but conservative people who live there and who are drawn there as well because of its cultural legacy. And then for the same reasons that everybody else is fascinated with Weimar in the aftermath of the First World War, the left-leaning avant-garde artists of the Bauhaus movement also decide to start their Bauhaus school in Weimar, and it's set up there by Walter Gropius, the famous architect. So he also moves from Berlin to Weimar with this and launches the Bauhaus school there. And of course, you can imagine that all the conservative people who live in Weimar aren't overly keen to have somebody come in and bring quite a modernist, very left-leaning movement, plenty of foreigners involved with it, plenty of Jewish people involved with it. So it has this sort of culture war thing that is going on in the Weimar Republic overall, kind of really takes place in Weimar itself as well, not least because the students of the Bauhaus actually live that sort of lifestyle as well. They walk around in these kind of almost proto-hippie-ish kind of clothes, like sandals and long coats. They call them Russian coats because they sort of look a bit almost like foreign, basically. They go skinny dipping in the River Ilm and that sort of thing. It doesn't go down particularly well with the conservative, snooty elites of Weimar at the time. And Gropius himself sort of said, I seem to have poked a wasp nest here of reactionary elements. And that's exactly why he went there, I think, in the first place.
But one thing, actually, and just sort of on a side, as you mentioned Hitler in front of the statue of Goethe and Schiller. I mean, what would Hitler have thought of Friedrich Schiller, who maybe people are unfamiliar with, wrote William Tell? this sort of stirring story of fight back against an overwhelming occupying power. What was Hitler's view on Schiller in his work and William Tell?
Well, Schiller overall is quite an evocative figure for conservatives at the time. So, for example, when the German National Theatre, as it's still called in Weimar, which was previously just the court theatre of the local Grand Duke, when that was named the German National Theatre because the National Assembly would take place there in 1919 to set up a democratic Germany, the kind of occasion was used to stage Schiller's William Tell, and you can tell that is basically the whole point of it. It's the stirring story of like national liberation and we're all together in this kind of, so it can be appropriated basically by different people for different purposes. Hitler himself is said to have not to have been overly enamored with Goethe and Schiller. It was just not his thing. He read works by both of them in prison whilst he was in prison after the Munich Putsch of 1923, and it never really had the same effect on him as, say, Wagner, for example. So Richard Wagner's operas were really what really stirred him and what got him going, whilst Schiller and Goethe not so much. But he had many people around him. Joseph Goebbels, for example, his propaganda man, who was also a philologist and really into kind of German history and literature. And he convinced him, for example, that this is a legacy worth using for the Nazi cause. There's also Baldur von Schirach, who features quite prominently in my book because he's from Weimar and grew up there as a child. And he becomes the Hitler Youth leader. And as a result of that, kind of having this Weimar legacy and wanting to bring it into the national youth movement under the Nazi regime, he also convinces Hitler that this Weimar legacy of Goethe and Schiller is worth tapping into. So Hitler does turn up to anniversaries and events in Weimar. He does and says all the right things, but you can tell his heart isn't really in it in quite the same way that he'll turn up in Bayreuth for the Wagner festivities and be kind of wholeheartedly immersed in it. We
should actually, I guess, step back a bit and talk about the book itself, because this is what I really enjoyed about it. And is the story of the Weimar Republic, but told through people that you found, in particularly one chap, who, but really extensive diaries and writings from the period. And it's such a good idea because I think when one learns, certainly speaking for me, learning this subject, I think it was a GCSE, we were taught Weimar going into the Nazi period. It didn't really hit home what it meant to the people living in Germany itself. And this is what's really interesting about the book. I mean, particularly, I think the name, was it Karl Weidich, who's very interesting. But I suppose this helps one connect really a lot more clearly with what the feeling is on the ground at the time. I thought that the impact of the Treaty of Versailles is really interesting because there's a genuine anger and upset over this. Beyond, I mean, I guess when I was learning it, I always assumed, it's, with politicians saying that, but it's the people who are really angry about it. Is that right? Yeah, and that's only what you see when you kind of look at people's diaries, for example, and what actually makes it into them. I mean, if you think, even people who write diaries today, by and large, they're not kind of Samuel Pepys type people who want to record their surroundings for posterity, but really kind of you write about, I don't know, being left by your girlfriend or having a row with your parents or having lost a lot of money or gained a lot of money or whatever, but personal things. So it's interesting what isn't in the diary, and you can see when politics come into it that it's often the things that have a direct impact on that person's lives or life. And the Treaty of Versailles is one such example where you can really see how people were so angered and just really frustrated with it, and they found it unfair, that you can see it no matter whether these people are kind of pro-democratic and pro-republican people, liberals, or whether that's kind of outright Nazis. It seems to have been a unifying factor that goes all the way through. So Karl certainly initially is not a particularly political person. He's a bookbinder by trade and comes to Weimar in 1914 because he's setting up a shop, a stationery shop in the town centre. He's just your ordinary
everyday guy, which is why I chose him, and also because his diary is so extensive. So he doesn't every day comment on whatever the politics of the day are, but when he does, it is because it either has a direct effect on him or it's something that he feels really strongly about. And with the Treaty of Versailles, you don't really get kind of anger as such in his diary, but there is frustration at times. So, for example, when Germany runs into trouble, and he just writes in there, well, I suppose the French are just supposed to suffocate in all that gold, are they? And you get kind of comments like that seep into his day-to-day recordings on what he does. So you can see that indignation is quite widespread, and it encompasses almost everybody in Germany at the time.
Yeah, so whether right or wrong, I mean, the feeling throughout Germany is obviously brewing throughout the 1920s. So it's Versailles. I mean, this isn't just political rabble-rousing on behalf of Hitler, in that there was genuine upset over it.
Yes, and he thought that he could use that for himself quite early on. This is one of the reasons why he launches a coup attempt in 1923, when he has no idea really whether people are going to follow him or not. I mean, it's quite a small movement at the time, the Nazi movement. Nowhere really on the national stage. People in Hamburg wouldn't have known who Adolf Hitler is supposed to be. But he just assumes that his own anger over the Treaty of Versailles and the fallout from it, so, the economic problems that follow later on, the invasion of the French of the Ruhr region in the west of Germany in 1923, he just assumes that his own anger will be reflected in the way that people feel about it. And so if he kind of, strikes the first match, as it were, he can ignite that whole tinderbox. It doesn't work, interestingly enough, in 1923. Even though that's arguably, well, not just arguably, that is the deepest crisis that this republic is in at that point. It's really an existential crisis, and still it isn't enough, because people, yes, they are angry, but also they want peace, they want stability, they don't want another kind of upheaval. And so that really is part of the zeitgeist as well, that what people really want is for their lives to come back to an ordinary, normal state. And I think they would have been able to overcome their resentments about the Treaty of Versailles if that had been, if the stability that we do briefly see in the mid-1920s had been carried forward. Because even then it's obvious that not all the stuff that's in the Treaty of Versailles will be kind of enacted as is, that over time it will be watered down and reduced. And that's exactly where a lot of the politicians hope that this will go in the 20s, and it could have gone down that way.
But it's so interesting I was looking at the list of Weimar chancellors, and there's quite a few.
That's right.
So that in itself, obviously that's not stability. So I guess it's just the churn was hugely kind of affecting to the people of Weimar and the rest of Germany.
Yeah, I think that is a big problem, is that you never really get stability, in the sense that people genuinely believe that now things are going forward, the next generation will see a better life and more stability again than before, that the system works. I mean, this is a problem as well, that when you set up a brand new system, a really kind of ultra liberal, ultra democratic system, even by our standards today, it's got less handrails, less sort of framework than we have today in most modern democracies. And people don't really see it work fully ever. And so they think back nostalgically at this point to the pre-1914 years, when Germany was kind of a half democracy under the Kaiser, and they think, well, it may not have been quite as democratic, but it worked. And they, begin to forget some of the social and political problems that they had then, grievances. And so, all of this kind of comes together to give the feeling of instability, that nothing really fully works. And then people look to Italy, where since 1922, you've got Mussolini coming to the fore. And Germany and Italy have always had quite a strong relationship, historically, going back even politically as well. So they look to that as an example of where Mussolini seems to have brought order, if you want to see it through that lens, basically from the German point of view, where he seems to have brought order to a chaotic country that wasn't doing particularly well after the First World War. And many people in Germany begin to long, for somebody to take the reins and just make decisions and move forward from this chaos.
Well, you talk about how uber liberal the Weimar Republic is. I mean, it really is revolutionary. I guess that's not necessarily appreciated, but at the time, I mean, as you say, I mean, is it the suffrage is almost universal, isn't it? I mean, a male and female age of 20 and over can vote.
Yeah, and it's the first time, obviously, that women get the vote as well as is the case in other European countries. And I found it really interesting looking at Weimar specifically because that's where the National Assembly happens in 1919. So this is where this first set of newly elected, all democratic sort of delegates meet to decide the future of Germany. So it's interesting to see how people respond to that. And I found that there was genuine enthusiasm there, especially women. They take this incredibly seriously. A lot of them go to like these kind of political education evenings. I found that quite amusing. So often you had in the papers when I was looking through them from the time, you had sort of little adverts that went, oh, Professor Dr. So-and-so, always kind of old men, obviously, who went, right, we're going to teach women how to vote and what, political responsibilities they have now. And people would actually sort of pay money to go to these evening lectures and seminars to be taught about how society works, what left-wing, what right-wing politics is, how the whole system works. I mean, ultimately, they hadn't really previously to the First World War been expected to even, kind of have a significant life outside the domestic sphere. That was just the way that society worked. And now suddenly they're supposed to be, politically educated enough basically to go and vote. And because they see this as such a big responsibility, a lot of them really do go and spend one evening at this party headquarters. The next evening they go to a different lecture. I follow a woman who's quite conservative in her diary through this time, and she even goes to an SPD meeting of the Social Democratic Party, which is quite left wing at the time, and she puts so in her diary, well, that was interesting. I'm not going to vote for them, but at least it was an interesting experience to see what they're about and what they want. So there was genuine enthusiasm. It's interesting and shocking to see how quickly that kind of ebbs when the hopes and expectations that people have aren't fulfilled.
Yes, because of course, that leads to the inevitable question of, you've written about this now, but we always think about contemporary events when reading about the past. And particularly with this sort of, I don't think the recent British governments can compete with the number of chancellors that the Weimar has. But I know when we spoke briefly last week, you mentioned you were slightly more optimistic for the present than others have been, because there's a lot of talk about, people see a lot of similarities between now and the kind of pre-war period, interwar period. I wonder if you could expand a little on that.
Yeah, I think I am a bit more optimistic in the sense that when you study the 1920s and the 1930s and you just realize just how much trouble the political world was in then. I mean, they were not just dealing with, we are obviously in a lot of trouble right now, economically speaking, say, for example, with inflation and cost of living providing problems and that kind of thing, but it's not anywhere near on the scale that the Wall Street crash was, and also the suddenness of it, I think, really coming on the back of this boom period in the 1920s, and then suddenly people feel like the rug's been pulled out from under them. It's horrendous, and it's difficult to see how even a more stable government at the time, as you do have in other countries, say in the US or in Britain at the time, how they would have coped with this and basically found a way forward. I mean, even in the US, where there's a really strong belief that the market will sort this out, and President Hoover is still trying to tell people that this is just a phase and you'll get out of this. But even there, you get somebody quite radical like FDR, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, coming in and basically doing some very un-American things in the way that he just takes charge and puts some really quite drastic state intervention in place with, work measures and so on. So you can see that the times were really quite severe and quite drastic in that respect. I think we do have issues with very similar things, and some of the patterns are the same. So I think, are also now at an economic point once again where something really quite stark's happening to the world economy, and you see sort of old certainties erode there. But I don't think we have quite the same shock moment. I think it's more gradual than that. And on political fragmentation, again, you see this in the Weimar Republic right from the beginning. As you say, there's kind of one chancellor after another. The system is such that you have, countless small political parties. At times you have 3, 4, 5 coalition partners in one government. I don't think we're quite there yet either. I think what's frustrating people now, and where a lot of this political anger is coming from, is from decisions that are made by current and previous governments, not by the external circumstances. Whilst I think in the Weimar Republic it was the opposite, kind of a lot of bad stuff was happening and politicians didn't seem to find solutions to that. And that's a very different thing. I think our problems today are ultimately, I think, more fixable than they were at the time. And it just takes a bit of kind of political, perhaps creativity, will, whatever, but they can be, I think, fixed and addressed. We're certainly not quite in the deep waters as people were in the early 1930s.
Yes, and if we're talking about Britain as well, we have a completely different electoral system. It would be strange to draw too many parallels, I suppose. But in Germany, which is more financially secure, I guess then that would mean that it'll be more of a stringent political setup to be able to resist any kind of splintering rise of a far-right party, even though AfD is doing well.
Yeah, I mean, they are different situations in that, as you say, the electoral systems are slightly different. I think Germany is also a lot more sensitive, for better or worse, towards sort of a far right or even right wing populist kind of groups rising, in the sense that it's always looking to its own history with a good degree of almost traumatic, I would say, emotions being attached to that. So that, I think, in my view, sometimes means that politicians are perhaps even overreacting with bans, or with the prospect of political bans, with kind of legislation, and that in turn tends to spiral the anger and frustration of those people who want an alternative, whatever that may look like, to current day politics. I think Germany has its own dynamics with this. I remember having an interview with a British journalist a few weeks ago, and he looked at me and he was left leaning, and he said to me, "Is Germany actually thinking about banning kind of the most popular political party right now, which is the AfD in the polls?" And I said, yes, funnily enough, they are. But it seems an absurd thought, I think, from a British point of view, to even think about a party ban, really, to try and ban an entire party, whilst to many Germans, that seems to be the way that you defend democracy, is that you try and kind of legislate against people who want to, or who seem to want to, erode it. So the situation is different, I would say, today, also in that the AfD just isn't the Nazi party in lots of ways. People forget, for example, whilst Hitler was elected into power, that the Nazis did have a large private army with the SA, with the stormtroopers of nearly 4 million men, and that they could have pushed their way into power if they'd wanted to do that. And many within the Nazi party said that that's what they should do. As far as I can see, the AfD have no intention of using sort of violence or, street violence in the same way that the Nazis did to even intimidate political opponents or anything like that. So there's a very different kind of world that we live in today, and that's due to the fact that we haven't come out of the First World War, which really brutalized an entire society at the time. It made life quite cheap, in the sense that political assassinations were rife, street violence was, and people accepted that in a way that I don't think we would today. So it's quite a different world that we live in. We have a political battle basically to fight today, for to try and find a way out of this impasse that we're in, rather than trying to kind of avert political revolutions or violence on the same scale.
But of course, the Holocaust looms over that period of history, and I had no idea that Buchenwald was so close to Weimar. And this is a really important part, I suppose, of Weimar history. I mean, like other populations who lived near camps, the Americans forced the population to go and see with their own eyes. And I find that, that's a striking scene that you've written about, and very powerful. Is that something that Weimar is unusual in, that I say many towns had camps near them, but not that many? I mean, not like every, large conurbation in Germany did. How significant was it for the population to face up to the crimes that had been committed? And did it hit home? Did it have an impact?
Yeah, I mean, I start the book with that scene because I think it is quite telling, both for Weimar, because it prided itself in being a civilized place of high culture, of having this long history of being a place of poets and thinkers and composers. And then you have one of the largest, some say the largest concentration camp on German soil right on its doorstep, Buchenwald. And the fact that residents sort of live just a stone's throw away, really. I mean, it's just a walk up the hill. When you come out of the town centre, you can walk there basically within a couple of hours or so. It's that close. And actually, Karl, for example, who I mentioned earlier, the bookbinder, he, like many Weimarers, goes up on that hill a lot for hiking, sledging, just as a sort of retreat, really, out of town. That's the Edersberg still, where the concentration camp is still being used for that today. So that really struck me, is how much did people actually know, and if they knew, what were their attitudes? Were they ignoring it? Were they trying to forget about it? Did they just feel they couldn't do anything about it, or did they support it? That's sort of what I wanted to know, and I guess that's what drove the Americans to say that 1,000 Weimarers should go up the hill in 1945 and see this camp that was right on their doorstep. And Karl is actually one of the people that goes up there, and he writes about it in his diary. And what I found striking with Karl is that he says in his diary, when he sees the absolute abject horror that took place there, the piled up bodies, the evidence of torture, evidence of kind of, willful mistreatment of people, that he says it filled his heart with disgust. That's the phrase that he uses. And then he also says this is our German downfall, meaning there's a collective we there that he's clearly a part of. So there's no attempt really to say that he pushes this from him, or that he says that this didn't happen, or the Americans sort of just made all of this up. I don't think that's the case. He also goes there later, once it becomes a memorial and a museum after the war, which is interesting. So he doesn't sort of say, I don't want anything to do with this. But at no point in his diary did I find a single trace of him thinking about his own responsibility. He doesn't sort of say, what could I have done personally, or as a society, what could we have done to stop this? It's kind of this idea that the individual is powerless in the face of larger developments around them, and that's how he finds his own sort of psychological escape, I guess, from this. And I think that's true for a lot of Germans. So the argument I make in the book is that generation just couldn't bring itself to confront what they sort of stood by or supported even. And that it sort of falls to us as future generations to make sense of what happens, because people clearly couldn't at the time, or wouldn't, rather. But there's no doubt in my mind that they knew about the camp. I mean, I found evidence of sort of children in Weimar taunting each other to say, if you don't behave, you go to Buchenwald, that kind of thing, which shows you how widespread the knowledge was. And also there's this rumor that went around in Weimar that because the bodies, initially Weimar initially Buchenwald didn't have a crematorium. So they had to take the bodies down from the camp into the town crematorium, just a normal cemetery in the town center. And there was this rumor that one of the carts with the bodies on it had sort of tipped over in the street, and one of the bodies had tumbled out onto the street. And whether that's true or not, the fact that those rumors were going around tells you that people knew that something very bad was going on there, and that the body count was racking up. So that's definitely there. But what I would say is that I don't think people understood just the sheer horror of the reality of the graphic, actuality of that camp. I think they pushed that away from their minds and just assumed it was a kind of present camp that the Nazis kind of ran on that hill. I mean, remember that we only found out later kind of the actual details of Auschwitz and what was going on there. So it's a complex picture that, I don't want to use to sort of wipe that away and say people didn't know. They did know. But I think they were able, because it's outside of town and kind of out of view, to psychologically push that away from them and still go hiking, even when they know there's a concentration camp right next to them.
Yes, having visited Sachsenhausen, I can see rooftops just over the walls. But it's worth speculating. I mean, it's not as though the Nazi regime, was going to respond to public opinion had there been discontent expressed. Hitler and his cronies are not going to change course simply because the people of Germany, who, as we learn at the end of the war, he seems to have contempt for, is going to change course at all.
Yeah, but they did push bit by bit to see how far they could go. So if you take their anti-Semitism, he didn't sort of set out in 1933 to build Auschwitz. You can see, for example, with anti-Jewish boycotts against the shops, they try that out. They do a one-day thing basically in 1933 and see how it goes and whether people go along with it or whether they push back. Then they realize that most people do actually just either go along with it or ignore it and basically don't go into the shops anymore. That are run by Jewish people. So they then extend this the next time they do a longer, more violent version of that. And so bit by bit, they do test how far they can go. And to give you one example, there's quite a famous example of where people successfully push back. And that's when they try to remove crucifixes from Bavarian classrooms. So Bavaria is an ultra-Catholic, conservative part of Germany where every classroom would have had a crucifix in it. And they tried to remove them in an effort to sort of secularize society. And at that point, mothers were so outraged that they basically made little crucifixes for their children to wear around their necks. So if there's not one in the classroom, there would now be 30 in a classroom. And they found out that they just couldn't do it. And they just rolled that policy back because it's just not worth the social upheaval. And so with the anti-Semitism as well, you can see, for example, they initially exempted couples where they were mixed couples. So one partner was Jewish and the other wasn't, because they knew that the non-Jewish partner would have probably kicked up a fuss if their partner was arrested or, dragged off to a concentration camp. And so in all of these examples, you can kind of see how they're not entirely sure how the population will respond. Even dictatorships, and people forget this, even dictatorships have to work with a degree of consent. They can't completely act against a population that, will rise up against what they do, because you will get an uprising of some description if people are pushed too far. So they do try, and disturbingly, they find that with most things, the majority of society kind of just goes along with it or ignores it. People are genuinely shocked, for example, when Kristallnacht happens, the Night of the Broken Glass, as the Nazis termed it in 1938. And you have widespread violence against Jewish shops, mainly in synagogues, but also against the people themselves. And you see even in Nazi reports that they gather kind of through, agents on the streets, as well as through reports that the left-wing opposition leaders who are still operating at that point, that they garner, that really people are quite shocked by the violence. That's not to say there wasn't anti-Semitism. There was, and most people did want to see Jews being pushed out of business and out of the economy, but they were shocked by the sheer violence of it. And again, then Hitler calls off kind of the excesses at the end of this and says, no, we need to now pretend kind of that we're quelling these uprisings and that we're the power of order. And you can see that if there had been more discontent voiced one way or another, that even the Nazi regime would have had to take that on board and do things differently.
Well, Katja, Weimar itself then, if we don't need to be panicking that things are going to descend into the horrors that those in the 1930s experienced, what is your assessment of what we need to learn about the Weimar Republic and the experience of Weimar itself?
Well, looking at Weimar itself, the thing that struck me is that most people were so concerned with their own personal lives. And that's, understandable given the crises that they went through and hyperinflation, for example. I mean, that really, shocked people to the core when the currency suddenly isn't worth anything anymore and your entire economic world just breaks apart. Those kinds of things make it understandable that people focus just on their own lives, but it means that you lose sight of the stuff that's around you. And I think there's a risk today that we do the same thing, that rather than watching the news, people just go, I just can't deal with this today. I'm just going to watch a film or, binge watch a TV series that gets me away and out of what is happening around me. And, this kind of escapist sort of attitude, I suppose. I can understand why people do that, but there's a danger that you then allow basically people to just make political decisions or economic decisions because you just don't care enough to do anything about it, and you've kind of withdrawn from that and you just live with whatever the outcome is. I don't think it's fair to call on individual people to say, you must rise up no matter the personal cost to you and to your family, because people will never do that if they feel that whatever they're doing, if they're speaking out that this is something that will risk their own children's say or their future prospects, then people won't. And you won't see that in any society, with a few exceptions always. I have a few of those in my book as well who carry on kind of resisting the Nazis all the way to the end, no matter how much it puts their own lives at risk and those of their family members. But they are always in the minority. So for me, the main takeaway is exactly that. Basically, regimes are always acutely aware of how people feel about stuff and how they respond to policies. And it's the little day-to-day things, where you just say, I'm not doing that, this is ridiculous. Or, there's enough public anger, especially now that for all the problems we have with our systems, we still have a free press. We still have things like social media, the opportunity to go out and demonstrate whatever. But basically a public sphere exists. And if enough people feel aggrieved about something, then they'll make that known, I think, to the authorities and to people who will then respond to it. And it doesn't need great big acts, basically. It's enough, small enough things in your day-to-day life where you're just not complying with something. But for that, you have to be kind of mentally engaged with it. And to be, to do that, you have to sort of look around you, see what's going on and try and, not withdraw into your own private sphere because everything around you seems to be too complicated or too aggravating, which I say is entirely understandable. But I think that's when it starts, when you allow people to do things that are really not right.
Yeah, so whatever the temptation, don't give in. Well, Katja, this has been fantastic. Thank you. The book, of course, there are links in the show notes for listeners. Weimar, best of luck with it. And thank you very much for coming on.
No, thank you for having me.
We've come to the end of this club meeting, so thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch about club benefits, please do, either by email or on X or Instagram. Links are in the show notes. I've also included my Substack link so members can read articles I've written on various matters that may be of interest. The History Book Club is written and presented by me, Oliver Webb-Carter. Music is by listener Chat DMZ. Episodes continue next week and every week, so please do join, subscribe, and if you can provide the club with a 5-star rating, we would be delighted. In the meantime, I thank you again, and now I have to usher members out into the real world. Until next time.
I was